Welcome to Habeas Treasures, where I try to decipher this book, There's Treasure Inside by Jon Collins Black, in order to find one of the 5 hidden treasures. On today's episode, I'll be continuing my breakdown of the Pokemon Box chapter. Let's begin. In the story, after the author sees the various bug-type Pokemon, he gets reunited with the Froakie and meets an elder Greninja. The author describes this encounter in the following way. Just then, I heard a stick snap. I turned around quickly to see the Froakie had suddenly reappeared. He hopped from one rock to another and landed with a thump onto my pack. And to my surprise, he had brought a friend of his own, none other than an elder Greninja. Now the real question is, who is the Greninja? The author presents this picture of the Greninja from the story on page 217. And as I pointed out in an earlier video, he looks a bit different than an actual Pokemon Greninja. So the question is, why? I think the clue to the true identity of the Greninja is disguised in the phrase, I heard a stick snap. And here's why. I did a Google search on elderly ninjas in pop culture, and one of the hits I got was Splinter from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It turns out that Splinter was originally created as a parody of a character from the Marvel comic Daredevil called Stick. Now, when I was growing up and somebody came up with a clever way to make fun of somebody else, we would say the phrase, oh snap, he burned you, or something like that. So the phrase, I heard a stick snap, could be referring to the creators of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles making fun of the character Stick from Daredevil by creating their own imitation, Master Splinter. And if you put the Greninja drawing from the book next to a picture of Splinter, you can start to see the similarity in the way that they stand and even their ears. Okay, so let's assume that the Greninja represents Master Splinter. Then it makes sense that on page 219, when the Greninja introduces the author to a wise Golem who happened to have a great idea about where to hide the treasure, that the Golem could be one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Still not convinced? Okay, let's take a look at what a Pokemon Golem looks like. Now, even though the Golem is a rock-type Pokemon, you can see that it looks kind of like a turtle jacked up on steroids. In fact, one Pokemon fan website describes a Golem as a bipedal tortoise-like boulder Pokemon with a spherical body covered by a shell of plated green rocks. So basically, turtle-like. All right. Well, if the Golem is one of the Ninja Turtles, which one is he likely to be? Master Splinter named the Ninja Turtles after famous Renaissance artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. And since the author describes the Golem as wise in the story, I think he's referring to the leader of the Ninja Turtles, Leonardo. Now, I also think Leonardo makes the most sense since the author includes a Leonardo da Vinci quote at the beginning of the introduction of part 2 of the book. The quote reads, "The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding." Now, after watching a PBS documentary on Leonardo da Vinci, I learned that he spent his entire life trying to understand how the world worked by studying nature. In fact, he has another famous quote, "Nature is the source of all true knowledge." And that's why I think the author includes this line on page 219 right before the wise Golem is introduced. Nature was alive all around us. And in an earlier video where I covered why I think Elk Place could be both where the author initially recruits the Froakie and where the locals turn up from time to time, there is this sculpture called The Source, which again might be a reference to the Leonardo da Vinci quote, "Nature is the source of all true knowledge." And speaking of Elk Place, remember how the main public library is located right across the street from Elk Place? And in earlier videos, I covered how I think libraries seem like they could be a theme in the Pokemon treasure. Well, right before the author hides the treasure in the story, he writes, "We circled back." Could he be referring to this circle design only found on the back of the main New Orleans library building? It would make sense since he also closes the story with the line, "I felt the least I could do was share it with you in this book." After all, book sharing is what libraries are for. Now, of course, "we circle back" could also be a double clue, and the circle could be a reference to the shape of Leonardo's turtle shell that he wears on his back. Now, in my research, I did come across one very interesting connection between Leonardo da Vinci and the city of New Orleans. It turns out that in 2005, a painting was sold at a New Orleans auction house for $1,175, and that turned out to be an authentic Leonardo da Vinci painting called the Salvator Mundi that later sold for $450 million in 2017, making it the most expensive painting ever. Pretty crazy. Now, the auction house that sold the painting in New Orleans is located here on St. Charles Avenue. This location for the auction house that sold the Salvator Mundi is a bit far from the Roosevelt Hotel, where I explained in an earlier video, I believe the overexposed picture with the hidden Mewtwo was taken right around the time they hid the treasure. However, there could be one more reason why this painting is important to the story. Let me explain. On page 213, the author summarizes the road trip he took when he was 5.5 by writing, "Those 14 days of sightseeing and camping were one grand and amazing delight. I spent hours turning over rocks and riverbeds and streams to find salamanders and crawdads. I hunted for grasshoppers during the day and chased fireflies after sundown. I tiptoed around dozens of hopping toads on visits to campground bathrooms in the dark." Okay, so there's a lot here. So let's start with the first line, 14 days, which can also be called a fortnight, like the video game. Now, in an earlier video, I made a connection to a New Orleans coffee bar arcade called Nostalgia, located on Camp Street. Nostalgia lets you play free video games while you wait and drink your coffee. And one of the arcade games they had when I was there was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game, which now seems fitting. But the reason I bring it up is that it's possible this passage in the book is another video game reference. Here's why. In Fortnite, you guide your character around an open map looking to shoot opponents. Your gun is equipped with a scope that you can use to zoom in. This could be what he means by sightseeing. Also, camping is a phrase commonly used to describe players in the game who hide and wait to surprise other players that unexpectedly walk by. And the word streams could apply to streamers. And these are people who record their games and broadcast them on YouTube or Twitch for their fans to watch. In order to make themselves more difficult to hit, some players will hop around like grasshoppers or hopping toads like this. And the game also has a night mode where after sundown you can track your enemy while watching for their gunfire, which kind of looks like fireflies in the dark. And you also have to be careful when approaching an enemy because they can hear your footsteps, especially if you're running. Therefore, players will walk slowly or tiptoe in order to sneak up on an opponent. Okay, but what does Fortnite have to do with Leonardo da Vinci painting? Well, Fortnite originally launched with a game mode called Save the World, before switching to the Battle Royale format that made the game a worldwide phenomenon. And if you translate the name of the Da Vinci painting Salvator Mundi into English, it means Savior of the World. Now, personally, I love the idea of connecting the Pokemon treasure to this hidden Leonardo da Vinci painting. I mean, talk about the ultimate treasure find. Imagine paying $1,100 for a painting that turns out to be worth $450 million. Okay, so if you take a leap of faith and assume that the author is making a Leonardo da Vinci connection to the treasure, then you may be wondering, are there other parts of the story that could also tie into this theme? Well, the paragraph after the Fortnite-themed one is about the author discovering Pokemon Go when he visited Portland, Maine on his way to a wedding. It turns out that Portland Museum of Art has what experts think is an early preparatory painting of the Mona Lisa that Leonardo may have painted himself. In many ways, it's similar to the Salvator Mundi painting that was sold in New Orleans. Both paintings have questions about their authenticity, and both have strong ties to Leonardo. Is this why the author includes Portland, Maine in the Pokemon story? I think so, and here's why. On page 214, the author continues the Portland, Maine story by writing, "As we strolled along the city streets, we noticed an unusually large number of people out and about. This was not your typical weekend foot traffic of restaurant and club seekers. No, these were masses of people congregating in groups staked out at street corners, huddled around fountains, and sharing benches that lined city parks. No storefront awnings were left unoccupied, and almost all of these people had their arms out, phones extended, peering at, or rather through, their devices. They were all searching for Pokemon." I think this passage is another link to Leonardo da Vinci, specifically to his famous painting of The Last Supper. The painting depicts the moment when Jesus tells his 12 disciples that one of them will betray him, which leads to his crucifixion. Leonardo shows the disciples in the painting all reacting to the news in different ways. Let's compare the painting to the passage. Masses of people could be a reference to a religious service or mass. Same thing with congregating in groups being linked to church congregations and the religious groups shown in the painting. Staked out at street corners could be a reference to the Jesus crucifixion, since street corners are where two roads cross and Jesus was nailed or staked to a cross. And in the painting, all the disciples are huddled around Jesus, and in the Bible, God is called the fountain of life. So this could be the reason for the line, "huddled around fountains." And of course, all the participants at the Last Supper are sharing a bench, and almost all of them have their arms out expressing their reaction to news of Jesus' betrayal. And going back to the beginning of the paragraph, at the beginning of the Last Supper, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples to demonstrate humility and service. For this reason, Leonardo purposely shows the feet in the painting under the table. So it makes sense that the author might be alluding to this with the phrase foot traffic, and of course the word restaurant goes along with the name of the painting, The Last Supper, as does the phrase club seekers, as in supper club. Okay, this may seem a little far-fetched, but I'll leave you with one last piece of information that may convince you. The last couple of sentences of the Portland, Maine story describes the crowd's initial experience with augmented reality. The author writes, and almost all of these people had their arms out, phones extended, peering at, or rather through their devices. They were all searching for Pokemon. Well, Walter Isaacson, the famous biographer who wrote a book on Leonardo da Vinci, also wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2017 describing how da Vinci used his understanding of science and optics to paint the Mona Lisa in a new way that was an early example of augmented reality. Listen to this clip from a video about that article.
Leaning on science, Leonardo da Vinci was able to create a living smile, one that is elusive if we are too intent on seeing it. Stand before the painting, and the science, magic, and art all blur together into what some consider to be the world's first augmented reality experience.
Anyway, that's all I've got for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this and if you believe the Pokemon box hiding spot has something to do with New Orleans and Leonardo da Vinci.